I want to start with a name. Not a date this time, not a number. A name. Ella Harper. Born 1870, Maury County, Tennessee. Known professionally as the Camel Girl. Exhibited across the United States and parts of Europe throughout the 1880s as a medical curiosity, a biological anomaly, a thing to be looked at and wondered about, and then forgotten when the next act came on. The official record describes her condition as a rare joint disorder. Her knees bent backwards. She walked on all fours more comfortably than upright. The circus paid her well by the standards of the era, and she retired young and disappeared from public documentation entirely after 1886. I am not here to talk about Ella Harper specifically. I am here to talk about what her story represents. Because the 19th century had a category for people whose bodies did not fit the expected parameters. A formal institutional category with a name and an infrastructure and a budget and buildings. They called it exhibition. They called it medical curiosity. They called it, in the more charitable institutional language of the period, protective custody. And I want to ask a question that the official history of that era has never seriously asked. Who decided which bodies got exhibited and which bodies got something else entirely? Because exhibition was not the only option. Exhibition was what happened when the anomaly was small enough to be profitable, when the difference was visible but contained, when the body in question could stand on a stage and be looked at without generating the kind of response that required a different kind of management. What happened to the ones that couldn't fit on a stage? I have been sitting with that question for a long time, and the further I went into the institutional record of the 19th century, the asylum records, the hospital admissions logs, the county welfare documentation, the poorhouse registers, the more a specific pattern began to emerge. Not loud, not obvious. The kind of pattern you only see when you're looking at enough data points simultaneously that the shape becomes visible between them. There is a category of omission in 19th century institutional records that appears with unusual frequency in the decades following 1816. The language varies by institution, by country, by the individual clerk doing the recording, but the underlying description is consistent enough that once you learn to recognize it, you cannot stop seeing it. Admitted for ungovernable size. Admitted for physical condition incompatible with civil society. Admitted for anatomical presentation causing public disturbance. Admitted for gigantism of a degree requiring institutional supervision. That last phrase, gigantism of a degree requiring institutional supervision. I want you to hold that phrase for a moment, because it is doing something very specific. It is not describing a medical condition. It is not describing a behavioural problem. It is describing a size, a physical scale, a body that was too large for the normal infrastructure of civil life and was therefore removed from it. Not treated, not studied, at least not in any way that produced published findings. Removed. Placed behind institutional walls where the public record thins to almost nothing, and independent verification becomes essentially impossible. Now, before I go further, I need to connect this to the foundation we have been building across this series. We have already established, carefully with every appropriate qualification, that the official timeline of the 19th century contains structural problems that the mainstream account has never satisfyingly resolved. The architecture without builders, the cities without origins, the catastrophic atmospheric event of 1816 that may have functioned as the terminal moment of an older civilization. The bones that surfaced in canal excavations and railway cuttings and were documented by qualified observers before entering institutional possession and ceasing to exist in any public catalogue. We have established that the giants were not mythology, that their physical remains entered the archaeological record at a frequency that no honest reading of the evidence can dismiss as coincidence or journalistic exaggeration. And we have established that the institutional response to those remains followed a sequence so consistent across different nations and different decades that it cannot be explained as chaos or oversight. But here is what I have been holding back. Because the bones are one thing, bones are passive. Bones are already dead. Bones can be transferred and catalogued and locked away without generating the kind of immediate operational problem that requires a living response. What about the ones that were still alive? Because here is what the mainstream account of 19th century gigantism does not explain. The medical literature of that period, and I mean the actual literature, the journal articles, the case studies, the hospital reports, describes gigantism as a rare endocrine condition, a pituitary disorder, something that produces individuals of unusual height, but within a range that, while remarkable, remains recognizably human in scale. 7 feet, 7.5, in extreme cases 8 feet. Robert Wadlow, the tallest person in verified modern medical history, reached 8 feet 11 inches before his death at 22. That is the medical literature. Now go to the institutional records, not the medical journals, the asylum admission logs, the poorhouse registers, the county welfare documentation, the records that were kept not by physicians publishing findings, but by clerks recording intake. And in those records, in archives across the United States, across Britain, across Russia, across every country that maintained institutional infrastructure in the 19th century, you find descriptions that do not match the medical literature. Not 7 feet, not 8 feet. Descriptions that use different language entirely. Language that the clerks apparently reached for because the standard medical terminology did not cover what they were looking at. Of extraordinary stature beyond medical precedent. Of a scale not previously encountered in institutional experience. Requiring structural modification of standard accommodation. Unable to be housed in existing facilities without significant alteration. That last one. Unable to be housed in existing facilities without significant alteration. Think about what that means practically. A standard institutional bed in the 19th century was approximately 6 feet long. A standard door frame was approximately 6.5 feet high. If you are writing in an official record that your facility requires significant structural alteration to accommodate a new admission, you are not describing someone who is 7 feet tall. You are describing someone whose scale falls outside the range that the built environment was designed for. How far outside that range? The records do not say directly. They use institutional language that obscures rather than specifies. But the practical implications of the language they do use point in a direction that the official history of 19th century medicine has never followed. And I want to ask why. Because the asylum system of the 19th century was not a secretive institution. It was extensively documented. Reformers wrote about it, journalists investigated it, parliamentary committees examined it. The conditions inside were subject to public inquiry in ways that most 19th century institutions were not. And yet this specific category of admission, the ones requiring structural modification, the ones of extraordinary stature beyond medical precedent, appears in the intake records and then generates almost no downstream documentation. No published case studies, no follow-up reports, no transfer records to medical research facilities that would have had every professional incentive to study a genuine biological anomaly of that magnitude. They went in, the documentation stops, and the silence that follows has exactly the same shape as the silence around the bones. That shape is not accidental. I have been doing this long enough to know the difference between an archive that is incomplete because records were lost and an archive that is incomplete because someone decided what would and would not be preserved. The gaps in this record are not random. They cluster around a specific category of individual in a specific historical period. The decades immediately following the catastrophic atmospheric events of the early 19th century. The decades when the new civilization was establishing itself on top of whatever came before. The decades when the infrastructure of modern institutional life, the census, the asylum system, the poorhouse, the hospital, the registry, was being built precisely, I would argue, because something needed to be managed that the older informal systems of community and family could no longer contain. What needed to be managed? I think you already feel the shape of the answer. But I want to build it carefully because the evidence deserves that care. Let me tell you about the Oregon case. 1871. A county poorhouse in the Willamette Valley receives an admission described in the intake log as a male of indeterminate age presenting with gigantism of a severe and unprecedented degree. The clerk notes that the subject was brought in by a group of settlers who had found him, and I want to be precise about the language here because the language matters. Wandering in a confused state near the remains of a structure of unknown origin. That phrase, the remains of a structure of unknown origin, in 1871, in a region that had been under American settlement for less than 3 decades. What structure? Whose remains? The intake log does not say. It records the admission and then the record goes quiet in the specific way that records go quiet when the answer was decided above the level of the clerk doing the recording. The subject remained in institutional care for an unspecified period. No discharge record exists. No death record exists in the county register for any individual matching the admission description. He entered the system, and the system closed around him like water. I am not going to tell you that is proof of anything. I want to be precise about what I am presenting and what I am not. What I am presenting is a pattern, a frequency of institutional admission in a specific historical window, describing a specific category of individual, generating a specific category of silence in the downstream record. And I am asking the question that the pattern demands. If the giants of the old world, whatever their precise nature, whatever their relationship to the civilization we have been tracing through this series, if some of them survived the catastrophe of the early 19th century, if the reset was not total, if the freezing was not complete, if some of them came through the other side, confused and displaced, and wandering in a world that was already building the story of what had come before them, what would that world have done with them? It would have done exactly what the records show it did. It would have opened a door, put them inside, written a description in language designed to obscure rather than illuminate, and maintained a silence so complete and so consistent that a century and a half later, the only evidence that they existed at all is the shape of the gap they left behind. And I want to stay with that gap. because gaps in institutional records are not passive things. They are not simply the absence of information. They are the result of decisions. Someone decided what would be written down and what would not. Someone decided which admissions would generate case studies and which would generate silence. Someone decided that a category of individual that should have been the most scientifically significant discovery of the 19th century would instead be processed through the poorhouse system and the asylum system and the county welfare infrastructure, and then quietly allowed to disappear from the documentary record without a single published paper, without a single follow-up inquiry, without a single institutional curiosity about what had just walked through the door. That is not neglect. That is policy. And policy requires a decision maker. Policy requires someone who understood what they were looking at clearly enough to know that it could not be allowed into the public record. Not because it was dangerous in the immediate physical sense, but because it was dangerous in the historical sense. Because a living giant in an American poorhouse in 1871 is not just a medical anomaly. It is evidence. Evidence of a population that should not have existed according to the story that was already being written about what humanity was and where it had come from and how long it had been here in its current form. A living giant is a footnote that refuses to stay in the footnote. So they put it somewhere footnotes go, to disappear. Now I want to talk about the asylum system specifically, because I think this is the mechanism that most people in this conversation skip past. We talk about the bones, we talk about the Smithsonian, we talk about the suppressed excavation reports. But the asylum system of the 19th century was something different. It was not a research institution. It was not a place where things were studied and documented and eventually published. It was a place where things were placed when society had decided they did not fit. And the critical feature of the asylum system, the feature that makes it the perfect institutional solution to the problem of a surviving giant, is that admission required almost no justification and generated almost no accountability. In most American states in the 1870s and 1880s, a county official could commit an individual to an asylum on the basis of a single physician's signature. No trial, no public record beyond the intake log, no requirement to notify family, no timeline for review. The individual entered the system, and the system's obligation to the outside world ended at the intake desk. And the asylums themselves, the physical infrastructure, the buildings. I want you to think about where the large 19th century psychiatric institutions were located. Not in city centres, not in places with easy public access. On the edges of things, on large grounds behind walls. In rural counties where the nearest newspaper office was a day's ride away. The architecture of the 19th century asylum was specifically designed to contain and to obscure not just the inmates, the knowledge of the inmates. What was inside was not the public's business, and the physical design of the institution enforced that boundary as effectively as any legal prohibition. If you needed somewhere to put a body that could not be explained, a living body, a body that walked and breathed and presumably communicated in ways that would have made exhibition impossible and medical study dangerous, the 19th century asylum was the most perfect institutional solution available. Admission on minimal paperwork, location designed for isolation, internal documentation that stayed internal, and a cultural framework, the mad, the deviant, the ungovernable, that preemptively discredited anything the individual inside might say about themselves or their origins. Because that is the other thing I keep coming back to. The ones who were still alive could talk. We don't know what language, we don't know what they said or what they remembered or what they understood about what had happened to the world they had come from. But they were there, in those buildings, behind those walls, and if even a fraction of the institutional admissions I've been describing were what the language of the records suggests they were, then somewhere in the 19th century asylum system there were individuals who had direct living memory of the old world, of the civilization before the reset, of what Tartaria actually was from the inside, rather than from the archaeological inference we are left with today. And we will never know what they said, because the documentation stops at the intake desk, and the silence after that is the most complete silence in this entire story. I want to come now to something that has been sitting with me since I first started pulling this thread, because there is a category of 19th century asylum record that appears in the literature and then generates almost no academic follow-up: the escape reports. Asylum escape was not uncommon in the 19th century. The institutions were large, the staffing was thin, the security was inconsistent. People escaped regularly, and the records of those escapes are generally well preserved because escaped patients represented a public safety concern that generated newspaper coverage and official follow-up. The documentation trail for a standard escape is relatively complete. You can usually follow it from the initial report through the search and either the recapture or the eventual administrative closure of the case. But there is a subset of escape reports from this period that follows a different pattern, where the initial report is filed, where the search is documented, and where the case is closed, not with a recapture record, but with a single administrative notation: case closed, individual not recovered, no further action recommended. In a standard escape, that notation means the individual was presumed dead or had travelled far enough to be outside the institution's practical jurisdiction. But in the specific category of admissions I've been describing, the ones with the language about extraordinary stature and structural modification and gigantism beyond medical precedent, the escape reports that exist, and they are few, they are fragmentary, they are the kind of documents you find at the back of archive boxes that have not been opened in decades. Those reports describe searches that were called off with unusual speed. Searches that involve not just institution staff, but county officials, and in at least 2 documented cases, federal representatives whose presence in a county asylum escape investigation has never been adequately explained. What were federal officials doing at the scene of an asylum escape in rural Ohio in 1877? What were they looking for? Or more precisely, what were they making sure stayed unfound? Because the pattern of those searches, the speed of the closure, the level of official involvement, suggests that the priority was not recovering the individual. The priority was ensuring that the individual did not make contact with the general population, did not walk into a town, did not stand next to a building where someone with a camera might record the scale of what they were looking at, did not become, in other words, the kind of visible, undeniable physical evidence that the entire institutional apparatus had been designed to prevent from entering the public record. Some of them got out. That is what the escape reports suggest. Some of them walked out of those buildings and into a landscape that was already forgetting what they represented. And the official response was not to find them, it was to ensure they remained invisible, to close the case, to file the notation, to let the silence do what the walls had been doing. Where did they go? I don't know. I want to be honest with you about the limits of what this evidence can tell us. The records thin to nothing at the point where the escape reports close. What came after is not documented in any archive I have been able to access. Whether they survived, whether they found others, whether the last remnants of the old world's population lived out their remaining years in the wilderness margins of a civilization that had been built specifically to replace everything they represented, I don't know. But I keep thinking about the structure of the silence, the way it thickens at exactly the moments where the evidence should be richest, the intake records that go quiet, the escape reports that close too fast, the federal presence that is never explained, the bones that enter institutional possession and cease to exist in any public catalogue, the living admissions that generate no case studies, no follow-up, no published curiosity from a medical establishment that should have been fascinated. That structure is not accidental. It is the outline of something that was known, was managed, and was deliberately kept at a distance from the version of history that was handed to the generations that followed. The giants did not vanish from history. They were placed somewhere history was not allowed to follow. Behind institutional walls, inside systems designed for obscurity, in the silence between the intake record and the notation that closed the case. And the question I cannot stop thinking about is not where they went. It is what they knew, what they remembered, what they could have told us about the world that ended before the world we inherited began. That knowledge went in through those doors. It did not come back out. And somewhere in the back of an archive box that has not been opened in 150 years, in a folder behind a notation that says case closed, the shape of it is still there, waiting for someone to look. The next video goes somewhere this series has been building towards since the beginning. I wasn't ready to go there until now. See you there.